Good morning, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the latest episode of the Fifth Discipline Book Club. We are a small crew today, just Dave Eva and myself, Mark Richards. Eric is tied up in Thanksgiving festivities with the family, and we're not sure where Wolfgang is, but he's been a bit crook. So today we're opening with Chapter 9, which is Mental Models, and we're thinking we're going to get through Chapter 10 as well after our deep dives on Chapter 8 over the last 2 weeks.
And just to clarify, when Mark says Wolfgang's a bit crook, that means ill. That doesn't necessarily mean crook.
Thank you for that
Some
cultural
some some
translation,
some
Dave.
local nuance, yeah, a little bit of local nuance there.
So fundamentally, if you put it in context of where the book's at, really we're in that part of the book where he's diving through the various other disciplines. If we know that the whole thing is the fifth discipline is the fifth of five, um, our mastery depth charges were one of the other disciplines, mental models, and shared vision being, of course, two more of them. And we were just talking before we went on air that when we looked at these two chapters, they didn't hit us nearly as hard as the mastery one. I don't know if you wanted to add any more kind of thoughts to that, Dave, before we dive into the chapter.
No, I think the personal mastery one is was a very intriguing one for anyone who's in the coaching profession. These are still good. There's still some very nice little insights in here, but it is not as deep. So there's some nice paragraphs and passages in here, but we shouldn't be spending 2 sessions on one chapter this time.
All right, so let's kick it away. Mental models is the first of these chapters. And I've just got kind of quote to kick us off. What we carry in our heads are images, assumptions, and stories. And, I think for me, the summary of this chapter is the internal filter that we apply to the way we see the world, which is made up of a combination of images, assumptions, and stories. And through the first jump out quote that really digs a bit deeper into it, is this one: two people with different mental models can observe the same event, describe it differently because they've looked at different details and made different interpretations. And, again, a little bit later in that quote, as psychologists say, we observe selectively. So this is really the whole theme of the chapter is what's the filter we apply in terms of what we see and don't see when we look at anything that then influences what we do with that information. And I know, was it you who anchored this green quote about the Detroit executives, Dave, or was that an Eric feed before he decided not to join the conversation?
No, that was me. I just I just found that whole situation fascinating. That there's a piece in the book where they say that the car executives in Detroit felt that the Japanese industry was getting ahead of them, so they went and they had a look at what the Japanese were doing. And as the quote says, a little way into the conversation, it was clear the Detroit executives were unimpressed. I asked why, and one said they didn't show us real plants. And it's like, and that's why I put that little quote there, saying from Arthur C. Clarke that says any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The Japanese at that point were so far ahead that the Americans literally didn't believe what they were seeing. They thought it was fake. They thought it was unreal. And the Americans literally just couldn't work out what was going on. That's a hell of a lead in so many ways, that you've left your competition so behind that they don't even believe what you're showing them is real. That's astonishing.
Yeah, it was like I saw it when I was doing my prep last night, and I went, "Yeah, that's my first green quote for the chapter 2." It was just the most beautiful concept that you walk through and you do a tour and go, "It's been faked." Um,
Yeah, I've been in manufacturing operations for almost 30 years, and I can tell you those were not real plants. I mean, it just says everything, doesn't it?
So I highlighted a couple of quotes just straight after that one, and it was really on the back of it. The first of those one was the industry treated these principles as a magic formula for success for all time when all it had found was a particular set of conditions that were good for a limited time. And I think, given that I mean, we're all in the business of change, uh, and, we're working with organizations, generally large enterprise clients, who got to be large enterprises because they were good at what they did. And, what's baked into the mental model of the enterprise fundamentally is that they've had a magic formula that made them successful. And, we've been talking about agility, we've been talking about digital disruption for a while, right? The world is changing faster and faster. We need new ways of thinking and approaching things. And there's been a bit of debate recently, and sort of Mick Kirsten in Project Product got on this whole notion of revolutions. And, you had the Industrial Revolution, and we've been in the technological revolution recently, and SAFE certainly picked it up and backed it in recent versions of SAFE. There's been debate recently about the AI revolution, and whether we've actually entered another period and we've moved past the technology revolution, and we're now in the early stages of an AI revolution. And apparently people have gone back and checked, and the name escapes me now, of the person who came up with the sort of revolution basis for things. But I was part of a conversation a couple of weeks ago where it's like, okay, are we entering the next revolution? What did they think? And apparently they're not convinced. But it does sort of beg some questions to us, right? If you look at that and you say it is the next one, and just before we came on air, I was reading a deep dive into the recent going-ons at OpenAI.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Oh my goodness, it was fascinating. Boy, it was fascinating. And, that question that says, just how radically is the way we work about to be disrupted by AI? And how many questions is that going to ask of us? And Eric and I have been chewing on it a bit in terms of how it impacts the way we've approached agility.
It's certainly interesting to think that they were doing Kanban and Lean in the 70s, and then we had the agile thing came along in the kind of the late 90s, early 2000s. It's almost funny to think that we might, as the people who have been part of the adoption of those practices, it might almost be weird to think that we are now way behind the curve, and we are now looking at something that looks like magic and we don't understand it, and we're the ones that are used to the change, but we are behind the curve on this. It's kind of frightening to think how small a time box these new revolutions sit inside.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like
that was what I was thinking about when I was part of this discussion about, is it the new revolution? And it was a SAFE Fellows call, right? The guys at SAFE have been massively researching AI and what it means to incorporate that into the framework. And I just look back at the time boxes and the time periods and the gaps between revolutions, and this notion that we've got a new one before the old one's even really finished. And I think to me, it's pretty sensible. I mean, the more you deep dive into the world of leveraging AI, the more you go, oh my goodness, how much does this change? So
yeah, whole industries I think might be rendered relatively obsolete very soon, and we are just not prepared for most of that change at all.
no. So yes, the magic formula for success for all time. Very real. So looking at the next quote, the problem with mental models lies not in whether they're right or wrong, but definitional models of simplification. The problem arises when they become implicit, when they exist below the level of our awareness. I noticed you pulled up one of my favorite quotes, the Don Box one, in your prep notes.
Yeah, I mean, so we use these mental models to generate alignment with the way we think, so that we can see things in the same way. And we may not be fully correct with the way our model is, but as long as it gets some alignment and it gets us thinking in the same way, then I think they are enormously useful tools to make sure that we're all looking at the same thing. We're all kind of thinking in roughly the same way. Massively helpful, but they're never right. They're never correct. They are just letting us get a little bit more aligned.
Yeah, Eric and I were having a chat Saturday night about this one. It was funny because we took so long to get through the early chapters in the book. Like before our first episode, and we originally unbelievably naively said, "How about we do, you know, 4 sessions, a quarter of the book per session, and let's read up to the end of chapter 7 for the first session." And so I'd read up to chapter 7, and then of course it took us many, many sessions to get up to the end of chapter 7. And now I'm reading just ahead. So literally, you know, 2 of the last 3 days were making sure I plowed through these 2 chapters. And I hadn't read the mental models chapter, but I'd been doing a bunch of reflection on the kind of the power and the peril of a good visual model. And I was building a new product owner course a couple of weeks ago, and I'd riffed a lot on the double diamond in terms of various visuals of the double diamond, to talk about the notion of the life cycle of an epic, the life cycle of a feature, the different styles of treatment of them, how far through the double diamonds you might want to be at a particular point in time. And I'd shared a couple of those images in the Discord channel along the way, and various people had incredibly strong reactions to them. I hate the fact you've got that line there. It's a common thing. And
Okay.
we had a bit of a chat about it, and I went, okay, I hear what you're worried about, but I know the talk track that's going to go with that slide. And it's got nothing to do with the thing you're scared of. And it was good feedback because it prompted another little wave for me of thinking about some variations on the imagery. And then in the course itself, they played beautifully, right? Generated some fantastic discussions. But there was this kind of reflection for me, and I think the fifth discipline this whole process here has done nothing but make me even more reflective than I've been for the last 20 years, which was already stupidly reflective. And I found myself kind of going through this notion of, you get a great visual, right? And the double diamond is a great visual for a conversation, and you just add a little bit of flavor to it, and you go, and you can just recurringly bring it up again and again and again. So it's powerful, it's got that visual. But it's amazing how much a good visual leaves space for somebody to have a take on it. And, what did I know? I knew the things that I was going to be saying while the visual was on the screen. But everybody who was responding to my visuals was putting their own talk track on them.
Well, a good model leaves room for a little bit of interpretation that can help you with your framing. So that's the beauty of them. If they're too obvious, then they maybe aren't that useful. But they need you need a little bit of leeway for other people to explore around the edges. And I actually like the double diamond model. I think it's a great model.
I think it's a beautiful model. But I think the fascinating thing is, if you think about the impact of a personal mental model on the interpretation of a good model, right, you get a really interesting conversation. And this is what Eric and I riffed on a bit on Saturday night, is if you think about SAFe in the big picture is a model. And
that provokes a lot of conversation.
and different people look at it different ways, right? I look at it in a particular way. and I interpret it a particular way. There are many people in the agile community who look at it a very different way, and it provokes a very different response because of their mental model. There are organizations who have picked it up and looked at it through yet another model or internal mental model and interpreted it another way. And so you've got this thing which is, began as a really powerful visual, right? Is a composite picture of a way of approaching enterprise agility. And then there've been so many different mental models applied to it over the last 10, 11 years. For good
Well,
or evil.
when you look at the unfix model, the vision of the unfixed model, where
Yeah.
it's got an interpretation of how enterprise agile kind of scales and where it should scale. So, models are really useful things because you're looking at the same thing, you're just interpreting parts of it in completely different ways, and you can have a conversation about exactly what those different interpretations are. So,
Yeah.
where did you land? Just have interest with the double diamond conversation on the channel.
So at the end of the day, I landed with, I like it, but I'm using it very carefully. So I took their feedback and I went, okay, there's probably things that need to go on the slides because they'll keep the printouts of the workbook, but they won't keep the talk track that I gave it.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I added a little bit just to limit the amount that it could potentially sit in, the memory of the receiver in some of the negative ways people perceived. But I also know that when I used them during the MVP delivery of the course, they were great. Like, we created all the discussions I was hoping for.
Great.
So, it was fun, right? I anchored so much of the course on, as a product owner, right? For many things, you are following the double diamond, but think of it through an inception perspective, right? So you go a certain distance through the double diamond, and then literally you explode and zoom in to where you are in the double diamond, and then you're going to go through new double diamonds.
Okay. Wow. Interesting.
Well, if you think about, and let's say the classic safe epic feature story, that there's a world where you say, I travel a certain distance through the double diamond at the epic level, and then I zoom into features, and every feature should go through a double diamond. And I travel a certain distance through the feature double diamond before I go to stories, and then every story should go through a double diamond.
It's a fractal, isn't it? It's like a little fractal pattern that just
Yeah.
resonates. Yeah.
Yeah. And had fun with
Nice.
builds.
Like it. Yeah. Very good. I like that.
All right. It was funny actually while I was doing it because I was going back to. Do you remember we built that experiential product manager, product owner 1-day training when I was over with you?
Yeah, with all of the
six or
ticket.
7 years ago.
Yeah,
and
which box would this thing fit into, and that whole thing. Yeah, it was really good. Yeah.
What does your diary look like? I was back over those notes while I was building this course. So couple of memories of curry and beer.
It was a good it was a whole day's worth of stuff around that, wasn't it? With one of the
Yeah.
clients. It was a good session. Yeah, I remember it well.
All right. Moving on. So I loved, he had and the quote that I pulled out was, unless we influence the mental image, the picture of reality held by critical decision makers, our scenarios would be like water on stone. And the context was this view of the way that Royal Dutch Shell had reinvigorated their planning process prior to the introduction of OPEC. And their kind of revolution towards, instead of their central strategy group developing wonderful plans and handing them out, they're moving towards provoking the worldviews or challenging the worldviews of the various parts of the conglomerate to help them see a different possibility, and revealing mental models and challenging mental models. And it was a beautiful story about the way that they did that in terms of the incoming drivers for OPEC and the way that that was going to challenge foundational beliefs about the way the whole oil market worked globally.
Yeah, they created a whole load of scenarios, and I tried to do a little bit. I was very curious about what they looked like, so I tried to find some of them, and there were a few visuals from the 1970s of what they had, but I couldn't really understand what they were because I don't know much about oil. So yeah, but it is an amazing start, I think, to creating a scenario where you can discuss that makes it more real, makes it a thing that's actually tangible. Yeah.
I just love the framing of, instead of saying a scenario that says, to frame a scenario that says this is the new way the world works, framing a scenario that says the world doesn't work the way you think it does. And some things that you believe to be perpetually true are perhaps not perpetually true, and what difference that takes in terms of the engagement of people with a planning situation. So
Yeah, I guess scenario modeling, you're looking at the way things might be through a lens of like different types of events and different ranges of how things might fall. But I guess that's become quite, Monte Carlo analysis and things we do now, which is like looking at probabilistic forecasting and scenarios, is quite sophisticated. But back then, it must have been quite a big different way of looking at future. Yeah.
yeah. Next one jumped out for me. The danger of distributing power well is that you become fragmented, which makes ensuring that learning occurs across the business difficult. What's helped prevent that from happening here? A variety of networks we've developed to keep connecting people in a climate of openly talking about our problems and challenging each other's thinking. So there's another quote from another company. And the thing that struck me about this one was, we love to bang on about decentralization. It's kind of central to everything that we think about in terms of agility is decentralize, 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 and empower the people closest to the information to act. And if you think about it, what we're really saying is distribute power, right? And you know, our big enterprise clients, it's an interesting challenge getting that distribution of power. But I thought this was an interesting perspective in terms of going, well, imagine you do manage to decentralize and you do manage to distribute that power. Here's a repercussion, right? How do you get that learning across the business to be effective in a world where you've managed to effectively decentralize?
The whole talk about internal networks and delegation, it is a very modern thing today that most businesses aren't able to do well. The fact that they did that in the 70s is remarkable. I mean, it really is. That someone in that business had a real insight into the way you could make businesses adapt really quickly.
I I think the other thing though, and this is where it probably jumped to me, is like if I take the standard safe view, the standard safe view is construct a network organization and decentralize power and decision making to the network, right? So it's suggesting you take a network view that's based on value streams and then put your power there. But then the call out from this quote is actually you need other networks that cross cut that network to enable learning between the cells. And it's very easy, and most organizations would think, well, you just go up the chain, right? You got portfolios that have the spanning views that enable that, or whatever the case might be. But they're really talking about this notion of the peer to peer. And, is there a new way for us beyond chapters, which everybody thinks of as your second network for a lot of this stuff? Is there another way where we've got to actually start to think about peer-to-peer strategic information sharing as part of the puzzle of making value stream network organizations effectively information share and learn?
Well, I think later on in the book, they call it the disease of the traditional hierarchy, don't they? Which I think you've called
Yeah,
out later on in another one of your
yeah,
quotes. It's like, how do you break the up and down thing and get more side to side and point to point?
yeah,
And absolutely right. And this is a hard thing to do today, let alone what 50 years ago.
yeah.
A long time ago.
It's depressing how much we think of as new is actually old.
Very, yeah, it's very true. Very true.
So I guess moving towards the diseases of the hierarchy, I quite like the call out around the three facets of developing an organization's capacity to surface and test mental models. And that notion of, it's all well and good to know about mental models, but what do you do with that? So that notion of you need tools that promote personal awareness and reflective skills, infrastructures that institutionalize regular practice with them, and a culture that it promotes inquiry and challenging our thinking. I thought that was a nice little three-part model.
I hadn't actually reckoned. I must have skimmed over that bit because I don't remember that bit. But yeah, that is very nice. Yeah, very good. I didn't see that bit.
Well, it was all contained in a sentence, but I highlighted the sentence when I think this is a nice little framing. If you are thinking about, as a coach, what are you going to do systemically with this thinking with a client? Thinking about that kind of three-pronged approach stood out to me. So when I captured my notes, I went, I'm going to decompose that one sentence into something that's going to stick out at me on the mirror. Because, of course, he then goes into talking about some of those things as we get a bit deeper. So overcoming the basic diseases of the hierarchy, that was a beautiful heading for a kind of subchapter.
Yeah, I liked it a lot.
Yeah, that quote, right? O'Brien thought about cultural change in terms of basic diseases of traditional hierarchies and the required antidotes. We set out to find what would give the necessary organisation discipline to have work be more congruent with human nature, and identified a set of core values that are actually principles that overcome the basic diseases of the hierarchy. I just
No,
love the metaphor.
no, and I love the metaphor because I often think of transformation as being um, it's like the antibodies of the organization often fight back around the changes that you're trying to put in place. So it literally is like antibodies. It's like a disease. It's like a the body of the organization doesn't recognize the transformation you're trying to achieve because it's so different. So it kind of rejects it. And it genuinely, I do think of it in those terms sometimes. It's like I think it is a very useful metaphor.
So, so if you take where you're going there, though, you're actually saying agile's a disease as well.
Well, not a disease. It's I see what you're saying. It's it's a foreign presence that the rest of the organization doesn't like the look of or doesn't understand. And maybe some of that's um not communicating particularly effectively, but sometimes you do spin up pilot. You do spin up a pilot in a part of the system that is that's probably going to allow you to try some experiments, and sometimes there is a radical reaction in other parts of the business that see what you're doing and haven't been part of that kind of comm structure. So it's different and it's foreign, and I think those are two things that can cause quite significant reactions. So the antibody thing I think is a very useful metaphor. And of
Yes.
course, at that boundary of one system and another, you do need extremely good comms, so that it's seen less as a problematic change and more of a positive change.
Yeah. So moving along, and I'm just going to keep us ticking for the moment, I reckon. Next green quote I got was actually moving from the diseases into institutionalizing practice. And I just love this as a thing to have in the back of your head. It's less important, they concluded, to produce perfect plans than to use planning to force managers to think about their assumptions and thereby accelerate learning as a whole. And thinking through, because I mean, boy, the amount of things that we help with planning as coaches, the amount of planning that we facilitate, that notion of planning as a means of flushing assumptions and testing them is a really
Yeah.
nice mental anchor for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Let's try something, and let's learn from it, and then let's reassess what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to get there, and then just enough planning. Yeah.
Well, I think you can play it through a whole bunch of levels. So for example, for me, I believe setting OKRs is a type of planning, right? It's a very important part because you're, you're framing your strategy and thereby you're setting priorities. It's a
Yep.
planning activity. And I've been helping a group through some OKR setting over the last few weeks. And it began at some C-level OKRs, and then it cascaded to a response being made by a directorate to those C-level OKRs in this particular part of the enterprise. And so I was part of the C-level piece of the puzzle. Then I was part of helping the next group respond to them. And then yesterday I was dropping into a session where it was fundamentally a team of product managers with a suite of products going, what's our response? And for many, it was the first time they were framing OKRs. For some, they'd framed them before, but there were fresh eyes. And one of the things I've always felt with something like an OKR is the value of the key result is it crystallizes the objective. Because when you take an objective statement, you can read it 50 different ways, right? We're going to do X. And it's that point where your mental model just jumps all over it. Oh, that means this. And the moment when you start to set your key results is the moment when you start to flush assumptions. And
Yeah, that's where a lot of real alignment, is generated at that point, isn't it? Because you all know, where you want to be, but you're not quite sure exactly how to measure it. But yeah, but I think the whole point about planning is it's got a bit of a bad rep over time, and Agile's all about putting just enough plans in place to enable us to get to where we think we want to go. But then we kind of loop back and say, did we get what we expected? And let's reassess whether or not those goals are accurate goals. But it's always been part of what we do in Agile. Is there always have to be plans? You can't just go without plans, right?
But I think, and what I loved about this quote is this notion of what are the assumptions, not so much about just the plan, but the destination.
Yeah.
And sometimes you unpack to enough detail to realize you're thinking about very different destinations.
Yeah.
All right.
The circle coach thing, the next bit, I found very interesting.
I found it fascinating. So fascinating that I went and did some side reading and added a book to my reading list queue.
Which haven't you got enough already? Which book have you got now?
So I'm about to have a month on the road. From mid-December to mid-January, I'm traveling. And boy, am I looking forward to the amount of reading I'm going to get through.
Wow, that's a long old time you'll need about 25 books, won't you?
I've got 10 currently queued on the Kindle as must reads. So I'll get through the first 10 probably in the first 2 weeks, and then we'll worry about what adds.
Which book were you inspired to pick up then as a result of reading about these circle coaches?
So I think the thing that jumped out, maybe just for anybody who's listening rather than watching, the concept of circle coach, it's a deep dive in the book into something that Harley Davidson did in the 90s. And they introduced this concept of a circle coach chasing a different style of leadership. So, the just a couple of words from the quote, the circle coach was typically someone who would otherwise have been a VP of a fragmented function, like product development or manufacturing. In their concept of the job, the Harley managers envisioned the circle coach as someone who would possess acute communication, listening, and influencing skills, and would be highly regarded by all the circle members and by the motor company president. So I am reasonably familiar with the Harley story during the 90s from the book The Lean Machine. Have you would have read that, Dave? Yeah.
I have. I must admit, I must have read it very quickly because I don't remember a lot about it. So I probably need to reread it again, to be honest with you.
So it didn't talk about circle coaches or circles at all. The core premise of the book was, Harley nearly went bust early 80s, got saved, management buyout, can't let an organisation like Harley Davidson die. And they brought in TPS. So, the reason they were in horrible trouble was they had massive quality issues and massive issues in terms of order fulfillment in a timely fashion. And so the management buyout, and they locked stock and barrel, like it was unbelievably, we will do TPS by the book, or the Toyota Production System for those who are less acronym heavy than us. And then they got to the end of the 80s and they went, okay, we've fixed production. Right? We're now building high quality, we're fulfilling orders nice and fast. And then they said, we've got to turn our eyes to product development. And how do we get the same revolution in the R&D and product development space that we've just had in the manufacturing space? And they took a small group of executives and said, your job is to figure out how to do to R&D what we just did to manufacturing. And the book, The Lean Machine, is the story of their journey over the next 10 years. And they brought in Alan Ward as a consultant, and he wrote a very brilliant book on lean product and process development. And fundamentally, one of the stories of the book is to go, you can't apply TPS to R&D because TPS is designed for manufacturing. R&D needs a whole different interpretation of lean. And it's a wonderful book, and it was fascinating watching their learning journey on the way through it. But it never mentioned a circle. And I went, how can this be so foundational? Because it's a really interesting concept. And I did a little bit of extra digging. And I found an article, and I've linked the article on the Miro. It's a Harvard article. And it was an interview with the CEO at the time and the guy who was his chief consultant in the journey, which really dug into a book they had co-written. And the book was More Than a Motorcycle, I think was the name of the book. And it was the story of how they'd revolutionized their leadership culture over the 90s. That's the book that's going straight into my backlog.
Okay. Wow.
Because I was really curious. And I went, well, what is it? Because they had these notions of different circles and cross-functional circles. And I went, well, this is kind of interesting. I wonder what it really was. And so I just captured a couple of highlights from the article I found that convinced me I had to read the book. Shared leadership, individual management was one of their catchphrases. I thought, well, that's nice. And then I went, well, what was a circle and what was a circle coach, right? Was it, how senior were they? What was their voice? And they fundamentally said, we're going to have 3 foundational circles for the organization: the produce product circle, the create demand circle, and the provide support circle. And they said every circle is going to need a coach to find its way, right? Because we're not going to change our leadership culture by accident. And this was my interest, was like, what kind of people did they put in as circle coaches? Well, the marketing vice president, the acting head of the motorcycle company, and the vice president of manufacturing. They were the circle coaches. And
pretty substantial people, right?
And they basically took them out of the hierarchy, back to the diseases of the hierarchy. They took them out of the hierarchy and said, coach the formation of the new leadership culture, and get this model working. And they had this underlying philosophy, right? Get the right people together at the right time to do the right work right. And then I love this other call out that they had as a quote from the book. We wanted teamwork without the teams. So, cross-functional leadership teams has always been a big thread for me, and I know you and I have talked about that quite a bit in
Well,
pubs in London.
teamwork without teams and the idea of natural work groups that emerge. I mean, that again, that's just the company organically grows around the things it needs to produce. That's remarkable. I mean, was this was this 90s?
Yeah,
I'm not sure that I
yeah,
really.
90s.
Wow.
So, welcome to another book on the book list, mate.
Thank you. Well, every conversation I have with you, I come away with 3 new books. So it's yeah, that's one. I'm waiting for the next 2.
I haven't got any others for this particular discussion, but just keep waiting. So yeah, I just thought, I'm looking forward to reading the book to go. What new ideas can I take out of that concept of the circles? Because I've held for ages, right? If you can take the concept of agile team and apply it at senior leadership level, it's really powerful, but it's also really different. And it feels like in their circle model, they were building organic leadership teams, but still holding to that cross-functional aspect. So I'm expecting lots of good ideas.
Well, also the fact that they had people at that level of seniority that could take on that different cultural aspect that they brought in, by the looks of it, non-traditional senior leadership that could just mold themselves into a radically new structure without too many kind of problems. It does sound very interesting. Yeah, it sounds like, I don't know why that didn't make the first book. Why did that not get into the first book?
Look, I think the first book's focus was lead product development, not the entire organization. So the first book was written by one of the guys who was in this lean product development group. And obviously he would have, it was a brilliant book, right? He had all kinds of great ideas in there. But I think, and where it's jumping to me is, if you're looking to take, a big enterprise and generate true change, you've always got to have some key executives who can see the possibility and can lean in and spend time creating the possibility. And the challenge, and they've got to be senior enough to have an ear in the right circles and to know how life changes, like, what life is like when you interact with the board, for example, but also available enough to be present in making the change happen. And what I tend to find with large enterprise is you find those leaders and their life, because they're great leaders, their life is so busy, you know, attending to the myriad of things that come with being a senior leader at that level in an enterprise. And you sit there and you go, if only you could be more present in the change, that would be what made it happen. But, they snatch some time out, they get a little bit of stuff, they make some impact, and then they get dragged back into their regular world. And, I read this concept of the planning circles from Harley, and I went, they literally took them out of their regular world to go, it's more important for you to create this new leadership culture than to sit in your current spot in the hierarchy and deal with everything that comes with that. Yeah, it was interesting.
Very, very different. Yeah, I'm going to have to get this book too. I need to know how this happened.
All right. So reflective practice, last section of the chapter. I loved this first quote as kind of a priming for it. The most crucial mental models in any organization are those shared by key decision makers. Those models, if unexamined, limit an organization's range of actions to what is familiar and comfortable. Second, managers themselves, not just consultants or advisors, have to develop reflective and the face-to-face learning skills, or else there will be little impact on actual decisions and actions. You know.
Yeah, can't argue with that. I mean, it's Yeah. It's tough though. I mean, it's difficult to get those people the time you need in order to help them on that journey, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Link back straight away to the nature of the circle coaches. Because there's an argument there that said what they did was they found people who naturally lent into this new way of thinking at a senior leadership level, and then said, now your job is to work with the other senior leaders to take them on that journey as well.
that's a large, relatively instant cultural change that is a rare thing, a very, very rare thing for it to happen like that.
So I don't know what else we can add to that, but then the other one that jumped for me here, learning is eventually always about action. And one basic reflective skill involves using gaps between what we say and what we do as a vehicle for becoming more aware. And it was definitely the beginning of that. Learning is eventually always about action. So if you have an insight and you don't act on it, you haven't learned. And then if you act on it
Mm.
but don't reflect on it, you also can't learn. And that the relationship between learning and action, and I guess because I do so much training, it's very resonant with me. That I've always went, it's always putting someone on a training course if they're not going to use it pretty fast. But yeah, that's a nice little extra bit of nuance to it all. So, in passing, I saw the quote about psychologist George Miller's magic number 7 ± 2.
Yeah, I thought, hang on a minute, there's another one of these things that we think is modern isn't modern at all.
Because it takes you straight back to, and I think it's disappeared from most of the vocabulary these days, but how many years did we talk about a scrum team as 7 ± 2? And so I instantly went, is this where Scrum got the idea from? And it most surely must be, because when you actually dig into what Miller's magic number 7 was the number of concepts you could hold in your head at once. And obviously a relationship is a concept.
That's why I put the profound comment saying 2 pizza brains, which
So anyway, that was just a quick fun one on the way through. Moving down, right? Because I think this section here is, okay, we've recognized that mental models are powerful and that we've got to lean into them. But how do we actually generate that awareness of mental models and start to do something with this knowledge? And obviously, Sengi became a fanboy of Argyris and the work that Argyris did. And there was some interesting vulnerability in his writing about the ways in which Argyris schooled him and helped him recognize things in himself, which I thought was beautiful, because by this stage of the book, I'm just thinking this guy is unbelievably developed in his self-awareness and reflection. And then he's like, yeah, here's a place where I got taken to town. But I loved the left-hand column example that they gave, that, write out a sample of the exchange. And it was this exercise Argyris took them through of saying, think about a recent serious interaction you had with somebody that was perhaps a little bit raw, sort of fraught with emotion, and write the script of the exchange you had with that person on the right-hand side of the page, and then go to the left-hand side of the page and write what you're thinking but not saying in each stage of the conversation. And then compare what happens between the two things. And, he shared an example fully laid out. He shared some of the provocations it gave him. But I went, I've never seen that whole left-hand column concept before, but it seems profoundly powerful.
Yeah, the demonstration he gives is his colleague gives a, a presentation, and he couldn't be there to see the presentation. Then he comes back into the office and has a conversation with the person who gave the presentation, and on the left-hand side, he's kind of saying, like, what I'm thinking. I'm thinking everyone says the presentation was a bomb. Does he really not know how bad it was? And that's his mental kind of soundtrack that he writes down. And it's like I guess we all do that, don't we? Subconsciously, we're all having these kind of conversations with ourselves. But I've never heard of it described as the left-hand column. It's quite interesting.
No, I look, I read it and I went, how do I start to experiment with that? So I've made a commitment to myself that I'm going to try it a couple of times because, as a coach, you spend so much of your life not saying the things you're really thinking.
True. Yeah.
In various moments. But I'm going to go through it. I'm just going to run a couple of experiments and I'm going to pick a couple of conversations in coming times and then try journaling the conversation and the unsaid things, and then see whether that activity for myself gives me an insight into how I could have acted more powerfully as a coach in the moment. And then hopefully after I've done it to myself a few times, I'll figure out how to teach it to others and see what happens when I introduce it as a coaching tool. So
interesting. Yeah, I didn't see in the book what he did with it, like how he reconciled the conversation with his colleague about the presentation.
So the whole notion he had in the book was, and he didn't say this is what I did, but what he did do was say what you realize when you look at the left column is your underlying assumptions, right? It really makes your underlying assumptions stark to you and makes you realize how much your assumptions guide you and your interpretation, your action. But that actually what you want to do is, having recognized your assumptions, test them, right? And it could be as simple as, the first reaction you had, doesn't he know it was a bomb, right? And that everybody's talking about how bad it was. How could you test that with the person? Because you're fundamentally saying your assumption is, and your mental model of that person is, that they're completely unaware of the way people have reacted to it and the rumors running around the office, right? And that's telling you all kinds of things about, how blind are they? The truth is they might be fully aware, but they're just not able to express it. And if you've left yourself with that assumption that they just have no clue, right? How is that going to flavor so many other things that happen for you when you interact with that person? So that was, for me, it was the whole thread of this section of the chapter was become aware of your assumptions and then test them. And it just took me back to Jerry Weinberg and PSL, because there was this whole notion, and the problem-solving leadership course with Jerry Weinberg and Esther Darby. The thread of the course throughout the 6 days was become better at observation, but then test your assumptions about the things you've observed, because just because you've seen it doesn't mean you've understood it. And they took us through activity after activity after activity to help us realize that it was important to see something, but then until we clarified the observation, we were probably doing the wrong thing. And the simplest example they gave us was body language. So
as a body language, as an indication that you might have picked up the wrong thing. What do you mean by body language?
So think about, there's all these beliefs about body language, right? When somebody does X, it means Y. Okay. And their comment was, and they put us through an exercise where we actually got to validate this, and it was powerful. And then I use a lot when I'm teaching facilitation. So the classic one would be, every body language book would say when somebody crosses their arms and folds their arms, they're closing up. For me, when I cross my arms, it means I'm really leaning in and concentrating on listening. So if you know me and you know the way my body language works, if you see me cross my arms, you know you've got my absolute full attention and I'm thinking deeply on what you're saying, which is very different to I've just closed myself off.
It's back to that patterns thing, isn't it? Where sometimes our supposed knowledge of patterns gets us into a difficult situation where the patterns are the wrong pattern.
Yeah. So that, that was the teaching thread of PSL was, you know, pay more attention to what's happening and think about all the different things you could be observing, but then don't act on that except to find ways to clarify and inquire. And, what they did with us, they gave us this exercise where we all had different things to observe, right? What was the tone of voice? What was the relationship of questions to answers? How were people moving physically and reorienting themselves as a group? How was body language happening? And then we literally had one group doing an activity and another group observing different things. So it was 12 in the activity, 12 observers. Every one of the 12 observers was paying attention to something different. And then we did a debrief. And like it was a 10-minute activity and a 2-hour debrief. Where in the debrief, right, we'd taken our notes and they went, okay, what we want you to do is not just play back your observations, but inquire. So I noticed at this point that you moved from here to here. Can you tell me what was going on when you moved positions? And we'd get the feedback, right? And you'd see this thing of, what did I think was happening when that person moved? And what was really happening when they moved were very different things. And so, you've got to see it, but then you've got to inquire about it.
And did you
That's the
find that
linkage.
once you put the jigsaw together of all of those things, you had a radically different perspective with all of that other information than you had individually?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, interesting. So the journaling might allow you to put more pieces of the puzzle together that you can then learn more about that person's context.
Yes.
Interesting.
Prompts you with things to explore. And I think that was just the whole thread of this section of the chapter was, pay attention, realize where you might have assumptions, and then generate inquiry on the back of the assumption to validate or invalidate the interpretation you have of the data you're aware of.
Yeah, the bit after this about the advocacy and the bit
Yeah.
and that was quite interesting actually. I could recognize as a coach, I could recognize some ways of potentially improving myself in certain situations based off the back end of this chapter. That's for sure.
Yeah. And I think there was a bit around the advocacy where um like for me that was some of the processing we did on the systems models in earlier chapters of the snowball versus the balancing effect of do more, do more, do more, resist harder, resist harder, resist harder. To me, that was kind of, yeah, we've done that, right? But it was a nice reminder about advocacy versus inquiry. I particularly love, though, the quote about the fact that you rise through junior and middle management typically based on your advocacy skills.
Yeah.
And then when you hit senior positions, the things you confront become much more complex and diverse. And you can't survive on advocacy, you need to develop inquiry skills. And if you think about that notion of what happens as people rise through leadership positions and how, what are the number of jokes running about the natural point you rise to on the ladder where your
Is it the
failings are
Peter principle or
exposed.
something?
um, but that shift in perspective of going, executives get to where they are because they've fought their way up the ladder, typically. How do they fight their way up the ladder? Well, advocacy, go figure. But what got you here won't get you there.
Well,
And
and the ironic thing is when you get to a certain level, most of the data coming to you is through metrics that have already been filtered, and they aren't that data is not really real anymore. So you've got to go and ask lots of questions to try and get around the crazy metrics that arrive at your front door.
And and what's the realization for people to go, actually, my leadership style has to significantly change, but the leadership style that got me all those promotions is the thing that's no longer going to get me through my current level of seniority. It's an interesting provocation. Should we have a bit of a chat about the next chapter? Anything else in mental models?
The only thing I would say about people can live very well with a situation where they make their case and yet another view is implemented. And I think that as long as the learning process is open and everyone acts with integrity. So I think what I find is if we are looking at, put a little note there saying this is why collaborative prioritization with senior leadership teams works so well. If we start to look at the prioritization of things with different lenses, like cost of delay lenses, it gives everyone a chance to have a say. And even if the strategy lands on stuff that they are not fully on board with, and you've given them a say, and they've had a chance to address their concerns, and everyone's listened to their concerns, then they are okay to go with it. Usually they don't leave the room and try and phone around and start to undo all of the agreements. So I think that for me was a massive one. I didn't color it green, but in all of the work I do with senior leadership teams, when we are working with initiatives and we give everyone a chance to say their piece about what's on the table, that I think is an enormously powerful thing. And I probably should have colored that green because I think that's such an important thing.
I think there's a wrestle for us with some of these quotes where there's a lot of stuff that Senge says very well that we've known, believed, and practiced for a lot of years. And then there's some stuff that makes you look at your worldview differently. And like this quote made it on for me in blue because it's like, go figure. I've believed that for a long time. And cost of delay, I mean, you know, how many times have we talked about the value of the cost of delay discussions and the Safe City reveals on that front? And so I looked and I went, yeah, I've believed this forever. Right? I can't believe how many times I've stood at the front of the room and said this, but maybe this gives me another way of phrasing the thing that I've said a million times before. But listening to you just now, it's like, go figure, cost of delay should have been jumping straight into my head when I did that. So
it's fresh in my head because it's a thing I'm looking at right now with a client, and people are starting to say, yeah, it's not what I want, but we'll go with it. It's fine. Yeah, I think that looks right to me now, even though I've got one thing on there out of the three I wanted.
yeah, it's amazing how often in cost of delay, what doesn't matter is the number. In fact, the number that comes out at the end of cost delay is almost the least important thing. It's the
It's the
conversation
agreement.
and the
It's the
alignment. Yeah.
conversation. It's the agreement. The alignment. It's I'm happy that we've had a conversation around it. You've acknowledged my view on it. You've seen my perspective. I've given you my knowledge, and it didn't make it, but I'm okay with it, right? And it's like, yep, that's very, very powerful to get people on side.
And you could also argue that what happens during the discussions you provoke in cost of delay is you reveal assumptions. Assumptions about other people's perspective, assumptions around the benefits or otherwise of the thing that's under discussion. It's a great big assumption and mental model testing exercise going through the cost delay vetting process.
Yeah, but also the flushing assumptions is people learning about other perspectives, things they didn't know. So it's literally it's a perfect learning vehicle for senior people to progress.
There you go. Cost delay as a mental model tool. I like that one. Thanks for the pause. Let's go to, and I reckon we can get through this chapter pretty fast, weirdly enough, which is chapter 10 and shared vision. And the reason why I say weirdly enough, and it probably dovetails on that last little discussion, is the notion of shared vision has been so central to what we do in our coaching roles for so long. And we've read so many books about it and played with so many toys in it that I found when I got this chapter, it's like, yeah, seen it, done it. This book did it better. And
Yeah, I was the same. Yeah.
and it's like, well, shared vision is really important. We all believe that. But I really pull myself back to, are there some nuances that Sengi's pointing out about shared vision that I can add to the edges of all the other stuff that I think is really important about shared vision from everything else I've done. And so that was my focus as I was highlighting it. And I'm not sure if I've seen you highlight and you.
Mark, I didn't, because I didn't find much to put notes on this section. I was the same as you. I just thought, yeah, it was a longish chapter, but I didn't really think that there was anything spectacularly noteworthy. So I'm very intrigued as to what you've noted up on this section.
So let's maybe just play with the greens. I added some blues in case they linked with stuff you guys had picked up, or, a shared vision's not an idea. It's not an important idea such as freedom. It's rather a force in people's hearts. I just thought that was a beautiful phrasing. But let's go to the first green. And again, this was just like an interesting tweak. So while adaptive learning is possible without vision, generative learning occurs only when people are striving to accomplish something that matters deeply to them. And I read that and I went, adaptive learning versus generative learning. What on earth does he mean by that, right? And then he has the call out just after of generative learning as being expanding your ability to create. And so I grabbed it because I went, oh, that's an interesting nuance, the idea of the difference between adaptive and generative learning. So, is it truly profound? No, we're all big on learning. Is it interesting to recognize, hang on, there's two different types of learning? And I think as I reflect on that, I go, a lot of the time in organizations and clients, we're actually super focused on adaptive learning, right? You'd argue that the whole concept of Kaizen is adaptive learning.
Very true, actually.
And then you think about generative learning, and, it sits in my head because I've been on this crazy learning journey over the last 3 or 4 months with the various conversations we've been having in Shaping Agility and the types of things that I've been trying to learn as we go along this path. And the fact that, after 6 or 7 years of creating no new courses, I've created 2 new courses in the last 3 months.
Because you have a different vision of things. What is that? Is that because you've redefined your personal vision of what it is to coach?
No, I think the fact that I'm spending hours a week talking to you, talking to Eric, exploring ideas, testing my ideas and seeing what happens when you guys respond to them or take them in different directions. There's been a thread there, which is actually, I'm running all these things at the edge of my thinking past people who can critique and add to them. And that's feeding a level of creative juices. But then at the same time, I've been learning all of these things that I've never bothered to learn before. Like, I've had Photoshop and Premiere available to me for 7 or 8 years now with an Adobe subscription. I think I'd opened Photoshop twice in 6 years and Premiere once, and I kept them because the kids liked using them. And I'd looked and gone, there's a big long learning journey there, and I'm just not interested enough to care. But I've had to learn a lot about them with the whole streaming thing. And then with what I've learned about them, plus Midjourney, plus design thinking from a kind of graphical design perspective, when I sit down and make slides now, I make very different looking slides.
Interesting.
So I've got this whole, I've been testing and refining my ideas in collaboration with you guys, and I've been learning all these new techniques for bringing my ideas to life. And so it's actually been this whole generative learning process around expanding my ability to create. that I think's given the impetus to go, "Yeah, I'm going to do something with this," as opposed to going, I should build a course about this one day. I've just been building them on these mad creative bursts.
And do you find that energy a very, very different type of energy than the kind of energy you would have had before?
Yeah.
So this is like energy that's keying you up, that's feeding you rather than draining you.
Yeah. And it's visible to everybody around. But my wife, like, I just haven't seen you running at this level of buzz intensity in a very long time. She's likened it to some of the periods when I was still coding, where I would just disappear into my computer for 12 hours at a time.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah.
So
So you're in a state of flow quite a lot of the time now.
yeah, very much so. But the product owner course, 2-day product owner course, I went from a set of post-its as an outline on a Miro board to really nicely polished full experiential course for 2 days worth of content over 5 days. Now it was 5, probably 14-hour days.
And did it feel like about 2 days?
Yeah. It was just go and then sleep and then go again. I literally would be wake up in the morning, pour coffee, and reopen the deck to keep ploughing on it. There was no forcing, grinding. There was just what's the next step in the story. It was an experience I felt in a very long time. So
That's amazing. Yeah.
and arguably what happens? Well, I know what happens with Eric all the time is he tests my mental models. So go figure. All right. Why shared visions matter? I thought that the little call out, right, was quite nice. It may simply not be possible to convince human beings rationally to take a long-term view. People don't focus on the long term because they have to or because they want to. And, this thread that he ran all the way through the chapter about tension, and, short-termism and long-termism, right? We all struggle with that with our clients. But I don't think I've ever had a client who didn't want to spend more time on a long-term view. If only they could escape the pressures of their day-to-day reality and the next board meeting or the next advisory session or the next steerco.
Or the next set of P1 defects that have taken their systems down, and like the next paragraph says, it's like build as a way of becoming more future orientated, but most managers, when pressed, will admit their strategic plans reveal more about today's problems than tomorrow's opportunities, which is literally most people's lives, isn't it? It's the stress of today, not the fun of tomorrow.
The personal vision stuff, and this is where I think the nuance for me on this, the whole piece of it, was the participatory nature of vision setting. And I love the way that he ran this thread around the interaction between personal visions was the only way to get a true shared vision. Because, we do a lot of work with people about, create a good vision. Bring a group of leaders together to co-create a shared vision, because you need a compelling vision to motivate your people. And, any leader who's not part of the definition of the vision is probably going to struggle with supporting the vision. But then Senge takes it to the next level and goes, if you can't hit every employee and explore the way that their personal vision can become part of this bigger vision, and to actually see their personal vision, the bigger vision, then it's never going to truly come to life. And this intermingling of personal visions and the kind of iterative, interactive nature of it I thought that was a really interesting notion, right? Shared visions are built from personal visions.
I was just this whole chapter, I just kept relating the kinds of organizations I've worked with the kinds of things that they were saying in this chapter, and thinking how many of them actually are able to make this stuff come to life. And it isn't very many, is it? I mean, I don't know how many. I guess we shouldn't talk about clients, but I mean, many organizations I've worked with, this stuff is very, very difficult to make come to life.
Yes, it is. Let me give you another perspective, and this is kind of always the challenge back to me, is our job, right? That notionally the thing that they hire us to do is to help them make this come to life, right? Whenever I read a book, particularly a book like this, I'm saying, what does this show me about something I should have been paying more attention to in myself in helping a client? Right? Now, how many vision workshops have I facilitated in the last 10 years? I dread to think. So many. And, how many facilitation plans have I made for vision workshops? How much have I talked about the importance of vision and key ingredients in making a vision? And yet you run this thread that goes, for it to be a shared vision, it's got to be an intermingling of personal visions, and not just across the peer level of the executives who frame the vision, but across every individual in the organization. And you go, how does that change the way I'm approaching helping people with vision? That's a very different question.
It's a very different question. Yes. It's interesting that the open AI problems that you're seeing at the moment, that's when one person leaves that organization and then 500 people are going to resign in order to get that person back and that vision back again. That's an interesting example of a very significant person influencing a large percentage of the organization with a very clear vision that most people seem to have bought into, which I think is a very interesting, kind of very recent possible articulation of how this might work when it's done well.
And then I think you take the scary bit, which is, for the sake of the planet, that one person's vision deviation was not necessarily great for the planet.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm not sure we know the full details of exactly what happened there, but yeah, I think that's a fascinating example.
The article I was reading this morning was actually, it's really like, one of the things it did was it said, here's the way the organization's structured. And you've got the not-for-profit that owns various things before you get down to the commercially real thing. And the whole idea of the way it began was going, how do we create an organization that is focused on ethical alignment towards preventing the first sort of singularity event, AI deciding to destroy the planet? Right? That was the notion of the way the whole thing was formed, and the not-for-profit board was foundationally going, when we get the singularity event of the AI that is suddenly able to extend itself and do all kinds of things, and it's going to always be motivated by limiting the ability of humans to interfere with it. How do we make sure that the AI that achieves that is one that has some boundaries around it that means it's not going to just destroy the human race as its first act, right? And that the board members are basically constituted from people who are very focused on this ethical alignment of AI. And the board members who voted him out are the ones who were focused on ethical alignment of AI, right?
But there were, I think there were two slightly different visions, though, weren't there? One was the safety element, and one was the creating general AI for the betterment of humanity. Was the broader vision? Yeah. So there were two slightly divergent visions, which caused a bit of problems. But I think it's a fascinating way of having interesting vision and people with the ability to make sure that vision's well understood. But I don't understand quite how the board and the CEO, I don't understand that weirdness in not quite understanding where they're going. That's a bit odd.
Yeah, it was definitely it gave me a fresh perspective, but good example of vision. So moving on, next nuance. I quite liked his model around commitment versus enrollment versus various flavors of compliance. And, this notion that says somebody who's committed, wants it, will make it happen, and will create whatever laws and structures are needed to make it happen, right? They're so passionate that they'll just find creative ways to break things and move past obstacles. Then enrolled is, wants it and will do whatever's possible within the spirit of the law. So not quite so passionate, not willing to take as many risks and fight the system as hard, but still fired up. And then genuine compliance, sees the benefits of vision, does everything expected and more, follows the letter of the law, good soldier. And I would argue that if I look at everywhere that I've worked where we've been really successful with the vision side of it, what we've had is genuine compliance.
Yep.
Right? And I've actually had genuine compliance when it's written like this. I've had that as my goal state. And it was very confronting for me to see that and go, oh, he's defined that as genuine compliance. Like really confronting. And it was kind of backed up with his, the green quote I've got there, right? There's a world of difference between compliance and commitment. The committed person brings energy, passion, and excitement that can't be generated by someone who's only compliant, even genuinely compliant. The committed person doesn't play by the rules of the game. They're responsible for the game. If the rules of the game stand in the way of achieving the vision, they'll find ways to change the rules. A group of people truly committed to common visions and awesome force.
It's funny. I had a conversation today about, because in the UK, bonus season is just the other side of Christmas. So we're having a conversation about bonuses and the way that bonuses cause compliance rather than people who are willing to potentially break the rules in order to get the benefits of the end vision. And some of the cultural elements of the way that we construct bonuses just force people into a compliant nature.
Yeah.
And sometimes that culture is really, really bad.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to play with that model. It definitely, the resonant piece for me again is what was the nuance to this chapter. I think the nuance to me is realizing, despite thinking I've been all about coaching people down a vision-driven path for the last 10 years, that I've been setting the bar too low. So, wrapping with why visions die prematurely. I didn't copy quotes here, I copied models. I thought a couple of his system models were great. This system model about sort of the vision, right? So he starts with this snowball. You have a clarity of shared vision, which influences enthusiasm towards the vision, which influences people talking about the vision and beginning to pursue the vision, which influences clarity of shared vision. Welcome to your snowball loop. And then, and what happens as people start to talk about it is you're going to have diversity of views, you're going to have conflicting visions, you're going to have polarization. And that's actually going to be a balancing loop that impacts the snowball. And the thing that's going to drive the snowball versus the balance is your ability to inquire into and harmonize diversity. So as the vision catches fire and begins to potentially fragment in interpretation, how much are you able to explore that as opposed to trying to control it? back to the enrollment at Personal Vision. So I just thought it was a really nice kind of systems diagram as a reminder, the importance about the inquiry and harmonization process.
Yeah, and the culture of the organization to allow inquiry to happen, right? Open inquiry, open, honest questions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The second model was actually, I thought, for me, of the whole chapter, if there were a couple of interesting callouts, this was the really interesting provocation. So, separate model, same snowball. And this was the ability to hold creative tension, right? So, if you think about the snowball of the vision getting excited people, and then you have a perceived gap between the vision and reality and the discouragement that flows from that, and the limiting factor being the capacity to hold creative tension. And this is where he starts to link it all back together, because he's like, actually, if your ability to sustain your movement down this path of shared vision is limited by your capacity to hold creative tension, then you're going back into the personal mastery discipline, right? To go, well, we've got to build the personal mastery that enables us to develop that ability to hold creative tension, so that when we come together collectively behind shared vision, we've all built these skills of managing the creative tension to help us deal with the reality of the gap between the shared vision and the current reality. And that kind of interplay between the two was very nice.
And resisting the temptation to lower the quality of the vision and to keep and to keep it focused in on where it needs to be. Yeah.
And I think it's just that continuation of the thread. And he's run it at various points through the book. Every now and again, he goes, "Let me stitch it all back together." And it's that notion that says, I can't have an organization like this unless I've got people like this. And I also can't have people like this unless I've got an organization like this. And we're back in the level of glass in the water controlling our hand. It's both an organizational question and a people question, individual question. Which led me to my kind of final closing quote for the chapter. Vision paints the picture of what we want to create. System thinking reveals how we have created what we currently have.
Yeah, and I also love that last thing, which is vision becomes a living force only when people truly believe they can shape their future. And I think that is so true.
So,
interesting chapter. I mean, it wasn't. Let's say it wasn't chapter 8, but there was some interesting pieces in this. Yeah.
When I started the chapter, I went, "Oh, this is awesome! I'm going to be able to burn this chapter, right?" Because I'm 5 pages in, going, nothing new to see. Finally, we get a chapter that we are not going to get horrendously bogged down in with the provocation, and then you start to go, "Oh, there's an interesting tweak," and there were a few interesting tweaks by the time I got to the end of it.
Yeah, you've actually highlighted quite a lot, and yeah, you called out far more things than I'd noticed, but good call outs. Good call outs.
So, closing out, this is our first experiment with a 2-person book club. Reflections?
I just like the fact that we all do focus on slightly different things. And I don't read books like this, I will admit. So this does cause me to dig into things far more deeply than I ever would, which is a very useful thing, especially on a book like this, which has such remarkable depth for what we do. I had not, when you said, why don't we try reading the Fifth Discipline? I thought, yeah, why not? We'll skim through this one quite quickly. I had no idea that we would be spending this long on it, and I had no idea that I'd get this much value out of it. So, it's a very different way of reading, and some books are designed for this. I think this is one of them.
Yeah, completely agree. We're talking about Eric raised the question as to whether the new Gene Kim book is the next book club book. And I went, yeah, I've been kind of thinking that most books will be a book of the week style book, where we literally just get together and go, one session, what struck us in the book. And that had been my feeling about the new Gene Kim book, because that's generally my takeaways from his previous books. He does a beautiful job of storytelling, but doesn't mess with my head the way Sengi does. But I, the more books you've read, the longer you've been coaching, the harder it is to find things that really challenge your growth, and that's what I've been enjoying about this. But you're right, it's that diversity, right? The different things we highlight, the different things we see. I missed a third voice. It was fun. It was fun to just be the two of us, but that little bit of extra diversity.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's fun to bounce things between us, but a third hand, just as that little bit more diversity of thinking, which is interesting.
All right.
What do you think that? What do you think the upper limit of people for a book club would be?
To be honest, I think at this level of exploration, I think 5 would be a challenge. I think book of the week, 5, 6, easy, right? Because you got to set at a high level of abstraction. But if you think about when you go deep and the number of voices, because what's the fun, right? You hear some different perspectives and you play backwards and forwards, and you go, now that 3 or 4 of us have responded to the idea, I've got what I read, what I thought when I visualized what I read, what other people thought, which helped me to look at my original thinking differently. And then you come away and you get this nice new synthesis and deeper insight. But you got to hear every voice. And if you got to hear every voice to get that deeper insight, you're going to go really slowly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And so, if you had a 5-person group, I think there'd be a lot more half a chapter for a sessions.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, it's the tension in the pacing. So, no.
Okay, well, that's good. Good. Two chapters. That's good going. Good pace.
So we're nearly halfway through the book. I found myself looking at that, 48% read marker the other day, going, what I'm really hoping is there's going to be this massive set of appendices, or we're going to go, we've just processed so deeply on the first half of the book, the second half's going to go really fast. But I guess I'll find that out when I read my next 2 chapters.
Yeah, how many sessions have we had now? How many book clubs have we done?
This was number 7.
Oh wow! Okay. Could still be going by Easter.
Well, you think about it, and you go average hour and a half a session. So we've done 10 hours of processing on it together. And I was talking to somebody who watched last week, and they went, it was interesting looking at Eric's zoomed out view that he started the last session with, to realize just how many notes we've taken and the conversation we've had.
Yeah, I just zoomed out as well, and it's that's a lot.
Yeah,
that's a lot of stuff.
All right, I'm going to take us into the outro.